Our next speaker today, I'm very pleased to have him back with us today. He's no stranger to Kentucky now, and so we want to introduce Maurice McTigue of George Mason University. He is a seasoned expert on government reform. Maurice brings practical experience and scholarly research to the table from his distinguished career as a former cabinet minister and member of parliament in his native New Zealand and his decade-long tenure at the Mercatus Center. He held 7 different ministerial portfolios during his 9 years in the New Zealand Parliament, and I think most exciting was one of the architects of the New Zealand Miracle, you might have heard of, which dramatically reformed the country's government and economy by implementing market-driven pro-growth policies. If you haven't heard of that, you need to research that, and because I think it'll be really beneficial. Maurice also has extensive experience with government streamlining commissions in Virginia and Louisiana. He's come today to actually talk about how do we make our state more competitive and how to streamline our government. So let's give a warm Kentucky welcome today to Mr. Maurice McTigue. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you for the invitation to be back in Kentucky again. And as I look at the audience today, and I thought I can understand why everybody's sitting at the back of the room. They're about my age, and I find that if I'm going to read today, I need very long arms. So I understand why you're sitting away back there. I spent quite some time as a member of Parliament, but before that I was a farmer. You might call them ranchers here. One thing that I learned about farmers and farming is that they're very practical, down-to-earth people, and they do actually understand markets because they sell most of their product at markets. And you know that when you go to market, there's always some kind of a trade-off. If I ever went to market and sold some of my livestock and I got paid exactly what I asked for them, I was never too happy about it. I thought maybe I didn't ask enough. But if I found that I was offered significantly less than I wanted, I had to make a decision. Do I take what I can get and come back and get the rest at a later date? And those are some of the trade-offs that we have in markets, and I like using that word trade-offs, or those two words, trade-offs, rather than using the word compromise. Because compromise tends to be a word that has a weighted value to it. Whereas a trade-off is something that's acceptable. And I remember years ago one of my heroes, Winston Churchill, when he was questioned about a particular vote in the English Parliament where he'd been defeated, and he said, I am happy if I can get 75% of what I asked for. And he said, the other 25% that I lose, he said, I'll come back another day and try and get it then. So making progress is what's important. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we're now having to deal with in economies. So Kentucky struggles, and I wonder why. And I think the answer is that you're sort of living halfway between historic Kentucky and new Kentucky. That is, you're living with some of the old ideas and the old expectations, and you're not being adventurous enough and looking for the new opportunities. So the first thing is that competing is not with the state next door, and it's not with the other 50 states. It's with every nation on earth these days, and that's the big change. So decisions made in Kentucky have effects in Taiwan, in South Korea, in China. You don't actually see the jobs that don't occur here because they've gone somewhere else. That's the hard bit in terms of measuring performance. But it is possible to keep up to date with those things and to try and keep abreast of the changes. There's a country called Georgia just on the border of Russia. And Georgia came out of communism, very poor, everything like that, and it found that its economy was performing very poorly. In 2004, Georgia wiped out, by legislation, 85% of its regulations. Now, it didn't do it to try and make it more competitive. It did it to try and get on top of corruption, because giving people the power to make decisions is often the opportunity for corruption to occur. The interesting thing is that Georgia is now in the top 15 countries in the world in terms of competitiveness. And it's been because they followed on from that. Here's something that you might think about here. In Georgia, if you make an application for a permit and you don't get a response within 21 days, it's presumed approved. Good idea. That makes the bureaucracy hurry up. No reason why you couldn't do something like that. Those are some of the issues that competitiveness is about. It's not about giving out a lot of money. It's often about changing process and procedures. So, when you look at Kentucky, you find that you sit in the middle to the bottom of the rankings in the United States, and you don't have to be there. So when we talk about competitiveness, competitiveness is a measure of one economy's ability to successfully improve its prosperity in the face of competition with other economies. And that's happening all the time. If you stand still, if you don't do anything this year, you will go backwards. You will have lost ground with other economies by the end of the year. When you look at the United States used to continually rank number 1 and 2. It's now number 7. It's dropped 4 places in the last 2 years. Wonder why that's happened. My answer is that it's happened because the United States has lived in a period of uncertainty. There's been uncertainty about what taxes will be, what tax rates will be. There's been uncertainty about regulations, what kind of environment you will trade in, and that's made entrepreneurs uncertain and they haven't invested. We've got this strange phenomenon that the bank's been printing money as fast as it can get out of the presses and nothing much is happening. We've got corporate America sitting on $2.4 trillion in cash, some of it in the United States and some of it in other places around the world, not being invested because of that uncertainty. So a big lesson is create certainty if you want those investments to occur. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how you get out of the struggling situation. You have to think about creating a growth strategy. And growth strategies are a factor of capital investment that leads to job creation, that leads to prosperity. And often when I say that, people think that you're talking about the wealthy corporates and everything like that because you're talking about investment. No, I'm going to put that in a different light. Look at this example. Sorry, got a little bit ahead of myself there. So we have this situation where capital migrates to the friendliest environment. If it's not a friendly environment here, it's going to go somewhere else. A lot of that money that the Fed has been producing in the last few years finished up in places like Brazil and India and China, because there were environments where it was much more likely that you would be able to make money than you could here in the United States. Capital and jobs are very mobile. A decision made here that's not advantageous to job creation means that jobs will go somewhere else. Very hard to track that, but it does happen. There are places in the United States that do this well because they've developed a culture built around the idea of growth. Places like Texas and Virginia, but also places like Hong Kong and Singapore that rank number 1 and 2 in the world in competitiveness at the moment. When you think about things being tough in Kentucky, think about what you have to work with in Hong Kong or Singapore. Singapore is 9 miles long and 4 miles wide. Got 4 million people, no resources. Yet it's one of the most prosperous economies in the world. Hong Kong's even smaller. It's about the size of Louisville, the greater city of Louisville, in the area. It's got just on 7 million people, no resources. What it's learned though is how do you turn people into capital assets? And that, in my view, is the key of the economies of the future, turning people into capital assets. So when we look at this whole issue of investment, this equation never ever changes. Investment occurs, jobs are created, prosperity follows. But it's not just about the big investments, it's also about the little investments. So I want you to think about a sole proprietor bookstore. And the proprietor wants to add 1 job because the business is going well. So before she can do that, she has to add some extra counter space, she has to put in an extra cash register, she has to get some more bookshelves, she has to buy more books. So she's invested some thousands of dollars before she can create that 1 new job. That happens in every business. What you need to think about is what makes it attractive for that person to do that. If they have to deal with rules and regulations that are cumbersome, then that slows them down. If they have to deal with an environment where they're not certain about what the tax rate is going to be, that makes them say, well, I'll just go with the sole proprietorship. I won't add that extra job. Also, if you think about economic development, it's much better to have 1,000 businesses that add one more job than bring in one business that creates 1,000 jobs. Because during the year, those 1,000 businesses that have added one job might add another one. There's no way that 1,000-person business is going to go to 2,000 in the near future. But what you're also doing is that you're creating an environment that means that lots of new things will happen rather than stagnating. So when we look at Kentucky, what I really want you to do here is look at the states that are at the top, and they're consistently there. South Dakota, Texas, North Dakota, Utah, Virginia. But you look at the ones at the bottom, they're also in the same order all the time. So I'm not saying take any one of these particular indices as the golden rule. Look at them across the top and say, we've got to do something about getting Kentucky out of the bottom half and into the top 10. There is no reason that I can see why Kentucky could not be as successful as South Dakota. Now, if we look at the next thing, you'll see, is it possible to do this? And these are big losers and big winners, taken over the last 4 or 5 years. I want you to actually look at Louisiana. I've done quite a lot of stuff in Louisiana in the last few years. But Louisiana was perpetually down in the 40s. It's climbed 32 places in the last few years. Did it do anything kind of miraculous? No. Did Katrina cause it all? No. It actually was quite destructive. But they got a governor who came into office with one clear idea in mind. First big goal, I'm going to get on top of corruption. And he did that. Second big goal, we're going to do everything that's going to make it more attractive for investment to occur. And little by little they're doing that, and Louisiana is making real progress. You can see the same thing happening in Wisconsin and Mississippi and Wyoming and places like that. So they're not impossible states to follow. But you look at some of the other ones that are losing ground, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Maryland, those don't surprise you. But there's others that have lost ground at a more rapid rate if you take a longer period of time. Places like Illinois that went from the top 8 to the bottom 4 in a period of about 6 years. So, what I've got here is the ranking of Kentucky taken through this whole process of looking at how its competitiveness, and you'll see the rankings of the different things there, and I'm just going to pick out 1 or 2 of them that I think are important. If you look at number 4, the workforce, you rank number 31. I'm going to say that's a challenge that you should pick up and say, why can't we be in the top 10? And I'd suggest that you look at places like Louisiana that has a program that is called Fast Track, and it takes people from their unemployment into the workforce. It's recognized as being one of the best in the country. It is sort of the gold standard. But the challenge is to have your economic development people looking at who's the best at this stuff and how do we match them. And what I would suggest is that instead of looking at businesses that you can bring in, you should look at things that need to be done to make it attractive for businesses to grow. And some of those things would be looking at the areas where you perform poorly and saying, one by one, we're going to fix these. For example, it would be interesting to do a survey across Kentucky and find out which communities are the fastest at granting a building permit and which are the slowest. What would it take to make them all perform much better? I can speak with some authority on that. When I was in government in my own country, one of the things that we did was have a competitiveness study done of New Zealand. And what came back was done by Harvard, done by Michael Porter, and he said you have far too much bureaucracy and you need to get rid of some of it, but you have processes that are designed to suit government and not to suit industry. So he said when somebody makes an application for a permit, just require that every department that's involved in that has to deal with the application concurrently rather than sequentially. that got permitting down to 1/5 of the time that it took previously. Those are the kind of things that don't cost a lot of money, just require a little bit of brain power and a little bit of effort in saying, we can change these processes and we can do these things much more quickly. Because one of the biggest disincentives for investment is delay. Large businesses don't sit around with a lot of cash on the table waiting for you to get your act together. They want to be able to move right now, and if they can't move here, they will move somewhere else where they can move quickly, which might not even be in the United States. So the challenge, in my view, is to get your economic development cabinet and get them to start thinking differently about the things that they're doing. And the difference would be to concentrate on what are the issues that we could use to make Kentucky much more attractive. For example, why do you rank number 37 in business friendliness? Now, there's got to be something wrong if that's where you rank. It's got to be quite easy to say, hey, Mr. Business, tell me whatever it is that you want and I'll get it done for you. Make it easy. For example, I see you do some of this, but when somebody comes to apply for some authority to start a new enterprise or something like that, make us the government's responsibility to see that all of the other authorities flow at the same time. The business only has to appear at one site where it makes contact with government and everything else flows from it. Push that responsibility back on government to get those things, not in the hands of the business. Sure, they've got to fill out the form, but see that the government is responsible for that to happen. Why shouldn't they be? They're meant to be serving the public, not the public serving them. So push it around the other way. Don't feel upset about upsetting bureaucrats. That's their job. And their job is to actually make things happen. It's not your job to make their life easier. These are just some more pictures of some of the things that are happening in Kentucky. The yellow line shows what's happening in your workforce. I don't know exactly what's happening here, but the expectation in the eyes of businesses, because this is from the CEO magazine, is that workforce issues in Kentucky are getting worse, not better. So you need to look at those programs and say, if they're not producing people that are ready to go into the workforce, we need to change them. Because you've had them for a long time, there's no reason to continue to keep them. If they're not doing the job, get rid of them, get one that works, look at who's doing it well, and copy them. Don't feel embarrassed about copying other people's successes. That's the smart thing to do. Now, one of the ways in which you can do this is to actually create what we call streamlining commissions. What's the purpose of a streamlining commission? The purpose is really to gather all of the data, to look at what the options are, and to put it in front of the decision makers, that's you people, and say, here are the options. In my view, it's better when you create these streamlining commissions if you do not fill them up with politicians. Because it's easy for the politicians then to look at the result and say yes and no. But if they've been part of the process, then to some extent they're bought in. Also in the commissions that I've been involved with, where there's been a heavy weighting of politicians, it has tended to make the decisions or the recommendations less adventurous than they would otherwise be. Because the politicians sitting there think, I'm going to have to make a decision on that, I don't want to have to go that far. Whereas what you really want is you want somebody pushing that barrier right out, and you say, can't go that far, but we'd like to go there. And that would make you look at some of the things that really need looking at. For example, the governor recently had a commission that looked at your tax system. I applaud the fact that he did that. It would have been better, though, if he looked at how do you make the tax system more friendly to the business community, to the investing community. You've got something in excess of 70 taxes. Why not shoot for 10? Doesn't have to produce less revenue, but it's going to be a hell of a lot easier. You've got hundreds of regulations and forms that go with those. Let's get rid of those and see that you get it down to something that's much more manageable. That's the kind of thinking that's necessary to create a business-friendly environment. When you put a commission together, you can think about it in two ways. When we did it in Louisiana, we looked right across the entire government operation. And we looked across the entire government operation because the purpose was to try and fill the big hole that was going to be created by Medicaid. Because one of the weird things that happened in Louisiana was as a result of Katrina, per capita and income in Louisiana went up because of the recovery investments that were going on, so their level of subsidy dropped. So all of a sudden, the federal government was going to require from them a much bigger contribution to Medicaid. So we looked right across everything. But one of the things that you could also do is to set up commissions that have a very small perspective to look at just these issues of competitiveness would be good. But also to look at, say, specifically workforce. Who does this best? Why can't we do it better? What do you need to do to change the attitude of investors and to employers to the workforce in Kentucky? You need to have some buy-in from the legislature because you need to be able to see that the recommendations are going to get a hearing. Whether it's done through the office of the administration or whether it's done through the office of the legislature, in my view, is a moot point. In Virginia, it was done on the authority of the governor, and we looked in Virginia very much at how we could make Virginia more competitive. In Louisiana, it was done through the legislature, and there it was looking at how we filled a budget gap. Did they work? The answer is yes. Did they work perfectly? The answer is no. And I don't think you're ever going to get a perfect solution. Are you also going to get a situation where all of the recommendations are accepted? The answer is no. Sometimes it takes 3 or 4 efforts before you get a reform in place. That doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that it takes a while to educate people to the point where they feel comfortable about the change that you're going to make. So, economic development, in my view, is what I would call an intelligence gathering exercise that looks at what other places are doing and how you match that. Putting in place the regulations or in front of decision makers, the recommendations that are necessary to match or to exceed the performance of other places. Is it impossible? No, you can look at the states that have done it. Is it necessary? Yes, because you're going to get left behind if you don't. Does this happen just in the United States? No. If you look at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, you will see that the sequence of the nations keeps changing all the time as some make big reforms and others make no reforms at all. Standing still means that you go backwards. So it's not a situation where you can say there's a day in the future when this will be completed, we don't have to do anything more. All the time you're going to have to be vigilant to see that you keep up with the best of what's happening. That, in my view, is the role for economic development going forward. Here's just a comment or two about policymakers' responsibilities. And if this happened, most of the bad decisions wouldn't happen. You've got to know the likely consequences of the decision before the decision's made. And if you don't, my advice is refuse to vote, or refuse to vote until you do. Would be good if people in Congress had thought about that when they were passing Obamacare. You should never be placed in the situation where you're asked to vote for something you haven't had a chance to read. If you do, you should rebel. Before you make those decisions, you should know the effect on intentions of future capital investors. You should know the effect on existing businesses' abilities to compete. You should know the effect on existing jobs, and you should know the effect on the creation of future jobs. If that was a checklist of things, if you just check those off every time, you would find immediately that decision-making improved dramatically. So, with those few things and with issues like these that go to creating a capital-friendly environment, then I think you can look at a growth strategy versus a job strategy. If you think of it in terms of what would make investment come, you will get the jobs. If you think of a job strategy, you're going to screw it up. If you think of the key to growth is to encourage investment, and the strategy is that you identify barriers to investment and you take them away, then I think that you'll find that Kentucky moves rapidly up through those rankings so that you are in the top 10. How long should it take you to get there? Well, Louisiana's taken about 5 years to get from number 46 up to the top 10. So I'll give you 5 years to get to the top 10, because you don't have as far to go. You've only got to go from 36 to the top 10. But don't think about it in terms of there has to be a miracle. It's not a miracle. There's a lot of small things that you can do, and you can do them quite quickly. Thank you.